Okay, we started this sugya yesterday of Lachmei Toda, and that's where we stopped, and we have to continue in Lachmei Toda. We said that Lachmei Toda consists of 40 lechamim, 30 of which are matzah, 10 of which are chametz, and the 30 that are matzah divide up into 3 categories of 10 each. And those categories are called, let's just go through the names again. We have something called chalotz revuchos, and then we have something called rikikim mitchuchim b'shemen, and then we have chalotz belulos b'shemen. In any event, all told, we have 30 matzah, and we have 10 that are chametz. And those 10 are made up of 1 min. Now, these breads, which are called lachmei toda, are sanctified with the shechita of the korban toda, and the breads have to be eaten on the day of the shechita or the night that follows. And in that sense, lachmei toda have the status of kodshei kodshim. Now, he says, "L'chamim elu v'hayu asuyim me'esrim esronim solis." So you had totally a volume of 20 esronim, and it wasn't divided up equally. What do I mean? Half of these esronim, half of the 20, that's asara mehem, were dedicated for the 30 lachmei matzah. But half of the amount of esrim esronim, which means 10 esronim, were dedicated for producing those 10 lechamim that were cham. So you've got, in a sense, lopsided. You've got asara esronim to produce 30 matzahs, and another asara esronim, which is half of the entire volume of esrim esronim, to produce chametz. Nimtza shekol lechem matzah vayishlish isarim. Right, if you're starting with 10 isronim and you have to produce 30 matzahs, then each matzah is a shlish, is 1/3 of the isarim. So if you multiply 30 times 1/3, you end up with 10. The lechem, which is made up of 10 isronim, but you make 10 lachmei chametz, so that each lechem is made up of 1 isaron, whereas each matzah was made up of 1/3 of an isaron. And now the Mishnah establishes on Daf Chav Zayin that arba minim elu ma'akvim zetze, but there's a very great ambiguity about that phrase. The Mishnah is using a very vague phrase. It says that the 4 minim are ma'akvim zetze. What does that mean? One way of understanding it is that you need a representative, at least one of each of the 4 minim. So nechluku tanoim v'amoroim, there's going to be a machlokas of both tanoim and amoroim about this halacha of arba minim ma'akvim elu ezeh. According to one opinion, which is the Tanakama the Brisa, and Shmuel, the Amora, accepts that opinion, what this means is that lemitzvah, you need the entire minyan. You need all 40 lecham, 10 of each min. That's only lemitzvah. But b'di'evet, if he has 1 lechem of each one of the 4 minim, yotza. As long as we have at least minimum of 1 lechem that represents each of the 4 minim, we were yotze. And if I understand this correctly, it should be possible to have 4 lechamim and b'di'evet to be yotze the mitzvah of lachmei toda, because each one of these 4 lechamim was made and represents a different one of the 4 minim. However, we're going to see a footnote in just a minute. Now, the Brisa quotes a yesh omrim against the Tanakama. Rav Huda accepts the opinion of the yesh omrim that the minyan is ma'akev. I need 10 lechamim of each of the 4 minim, totaling 40 lechamim. The Yotze Elim Kain Hevi Asara lechamim mikol min. There are 4 minim, hence we need 40 lechamim. There's no room for compassion here. It's 40 or bust. Now there's a footnote here, Shin Lamed Beis. Dafka im hifrish meha isa arba lechamim litrumas hakohen. Okay, so these lechamim go to the kohen. Aval im ofa lechem echad mikol mid below shehifrish kohen meha isa. He did not take off of the dough enough for each one of the 4 lechamim. For all of the 4 lechamim. But rather, after he did the baking, that's already too late. So when he's mafresh from the Isa, 4 lechamim, right? He takes from this Isa 1, 2, 3, 4, 1 of each min, and then he bakes it. He can be makayim his mitzvah of truma l'kohanim from each min. Then, according to Shmuel, which is Tanakam the Brisa, he's Yotze. But if on the other hand, Afal lechem echad mikol min, he actually bakes 1 lechem from each min, but he was not mafresh from the Isa. Shuv lo yuchal lahafresh lo. At the point where you already have a baked bread, you cannot designate that for the Kohen. You have to designate it for the Kohen when it's in the state of Isa, before you bake it. Now he adds another sentence here, which is very important because I think it changes the pshat. But again, you know what? We have to know a little bit more about Lachmi Todu to really appreciate that sentence. I'll just say it in a general way, and hopefully we'll be able to fill out the details later on. He says the following, that when it comes to the Trumas Kohanim, there's a halach of hafrosha, which means that part of the lechem is given to the Kohen, and part is given to the Yisrael, the Baal HaKarban who brought a carbon toda because he was in one of the 4 categories of Arba Chayom Lahodos. Right? So let's say Ruvain got off a ship, he traveled across the seas, he's got to bring a carbon toda when he gets to Yerushalayim, and there are 40 lechem. And he's going to have to be mafresh part of the lechem for the Kohen, and the balance is for himself, maybe he could share it with his neighbors, and so forth and so on. Now, if he only has 4 lechamim, then he's going to have to be mafresh from each lechem and give that afrosha to the Kohen. That's a no-go. You give to a Kohen a full lechem. So if you have 40 lechamim, you can give 1 lechem from each of the 4 minim, a complete loaf to the Kohen. And that's feasible even in the case of 4 lechamim, if you are mafresh from the Isa for each one of these 4 minim. Because then I have a full loaf representing each of the 4 minim, according to Shmuel, and I can give them to the Kohen. But if I wasn't mafresh from the Isa itself, now I have 4 lechamim representing each one of the minim. I have to give each lechem as a full lechem to the Kohen. That I can't do, because then I'm lacking hafrosha. If it's at the point of the Isa, I can do hafrosha and take off and designate part of the Isa of each of the 4 minim for the Kohen. But once I have a full-fledged lechem, and now I need hafrosha, hafrosha in this case will require what we call prusa. Prusa means to slice the lechem so that I can be mafresh and take part of it for the Kohen and part of it for the Israel, for the Bailim. And that I can't do because the Torah requires that I give to the Kohen a full loaf, a complete loaf. Now, in the next paragraph, he discusses the question of shemen. Lachmei Toda require an accompaniment of shemen. And we're going to have to discuss the volume of the shemen to accompany the Lachmei Toda, but in two different veins. First, in terms of the matzah, the 30 lechamim that are matzah, representing three different minim, and then we can discuss the chametz, the 10 lechamim of chametz. Shir hashemen l'shloshim lachmei hamatzah v'yechatzi lug shemen. Now, chatzi lug shemen See, I'm not sure how to interpret this. What I think he means, tell me if you agree, is chatzi lug shemen. Not sure. Does he mean for all 30 or for each one of the 30? In Lamed Gimel, he doesn't tell you. For this, we have to open up the Mishnah. It's not clear to me. I mean, if I had to take a guess, I would be pure speculation because I didn't go through the Mishnah. He means a chatzi lug for each one of the lechamim. Not sure. In any event, how do we know, and maybe this will help answer our question, how do we derive this conclusion that the share of shemen from the 30 lechamim of matzah is a chatzi lug shemen? Rabbi Kiva says that's a drush, and Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah derives it from halacha l'Moshe Misina. Then he says, "V'lo yahav mischalek shir zeh b'shava, ela revius halug nitna lemin harakuva, shminis halug lemin hachalos ushminis halug lemin harakikin." So we have three minim of matzah, of 10 matzahs each min. One is called rikikin, the other is rekuva, and the third is chalos. And we're not going to divide up the shear of shemen equally. It sounds to me, I'm changing my mind a little bit. Sorry, I'm vacillating because I don't have the Mishnah. I think what he's saying is that the total amount of shemen, the volume of shemen for all 30, is chatzi lug. Let's see if the mathematics works out. So now we'll start with rekuva. Revucha. I always say rekuva when I mean revucha. Revucha is going to be a revius halug. Right? So we're going to divide up a chatzi lug in such a way that the revucha gets a revius halug. So revius halug is 50%. Okay, so now we're left with a Revi'as Halul. How do we divide up that Revi'as Halul? We divide it in two halves. We have a Shminas Halul and another Shminas Halul. A Shminas Halul goes for the Chalos, and a Shminas Halul goes for the Rikikin. Do you get the same impression that I get? That we're talking about a total volume of shemen of a chatzilul. That's the total. We're dividing it up amongst the different meaning. I'm not sure, but that's not what I said initially. I don't think. In the footnote, he just says mashma shagama chaluka hi alocha Moshe Sinai. That the way we divide it up in the three minim is also part of the alocha Sinai. Acharad baz kosa shekavanosel rak l'shir chatzilul. That halacha Moshe Sinai only tells me that we need a chatzilul. Exactly how to divide the chatzilul for the three minim, that's not part of the halacha Moshe Sinai, but that's derived from drushos. In the parsha of Revucha, it says bishemen, and that's an extra word, so that teaches me that Rechuva needs a double measure of shemen. Yesh mi rishonim chekasav, quoting Rashi and Nazir, shekenu rak Rabbi Akiva, ach ledas Rabbi Lozman Azaria, who has a halacha Moshe Sinai, by mischalek b'shava l'chol shloshes hamim. Okay, how Rashi knows such a thing, I don't know. Again, Rabbosai, I apologize. I don't have the Mishnah in front of me. The Mishnah is in Masechta Menachos Daf Ayin Zayin. I'm not going to ask you, Steve, to get the Mishnah, but if we had the Mishnah, maybe we would figure it out. But I think what we're saying is that the Chatzilul Shemen is going to be divided up amongst the entire 30 matzahs. Not sure. Trumas HaLechem. Yesh litol truma mikol min lechem echad, v'litno lekohen. So the Torah obligates me, in the case of lachmi toda, not only to bring the korban, the toda, and accompany it with lachmi toda, but also to give mikol min one lechem to the kohen. So imagine I have 4 minim, 10 lechamim in each min, 1 lechem from each min is going to be donated to the kohen. And I assume, like all other matnas kunitz, the kohen of my choice. Shenemar, vehikriv mimenu echad mikol korban truma l'Hashem. Echad means a full loaf, an entire lechem. Now the pasuk says, you happen to have a chumash? If you could open up to Vayikra Zion, pasuk Yudalit, Steve. I'm pretty sure this is all part of the pasuk. Lakoin azorik es adam hashlamim lo yir. Just give me a yes or a no that does appear in the pasuk. It's Vayikra Perek Zion, pasuk Yudalit. Yeah, it says Lakoin Azorik es adam hashlamim lo yir. Do those words appear in the Torah? Right means yes. Oh, So on both sides, this is radically different than any other matnas kahuna. In any classic matnas kahuna, the Bailam have a mitzvah of hafrasha, but the mitzvah of nesina is the coin of your choice. Here, the Torah specifies one particular coin, and that's the coin azorikas adam, meaning the lachmei toda are sanctified by the shlomim, which is called the toda, and whoever is zocher, merits to be the coin azorikas adam because he's on duty that day. He's in the Yanshe Mishmar. He also gets rights to one lechem from each of the 10 lechem, the 10 minim of lechem. So the Bailam will give him the lechem and fulfill the mitzvah of Messina, but they don't have the choice of which coin they want to give it to. Now, what would be the evidence if they gave it to another coin? I don't know. But the Torah seems to be very explicit here that it's the coin Azorikas Adam that gets the lechem. And it's very interesting because you can have one coin who does the shchita, another coin does the holacha, a third coin does the zrika, but the zrika is the machaper of the karban. It, shall we say, is the crescendo, the clincher. And that coin, who is the zorek, he gets the lechem. Now, what about tnufa? Okay, lechem zeh, oya munaf lifnei Hashem, yachad im hachazev hashok va'imurim shalatov. Once again, it's quite vague over here. He's just giving you a very digested summary. So he doesn't go into the details. He just says lechem zeh hayamunaf. So I don't know what he means by zeh. I mean, I assume he means the lechem that's given to the kohen, and that makes sense because he attaches the lechem or the tnufa of the lechem together with the chaz of a shok. And chaz of a shok is the part of a carbon shlama that's given to the kohen. If I think the word zeh here in terms of lechem zeh is that lechem that's given to the kohen, that requires tnufa. Then there's a murim of the carbon toda, which is brought by the kohen on the mizbech with haktorah. And the impression you get, again, everything here is a little bit iffy, that even the murim requires tnufa. So you have tnufa on number one, the lechem, tnufa on the chaz of a shok, and then tnufa, last but not least, on the murim. Then he quotes Rav, Zar ha'ochel truma zu b'mezid. We know that in the case of truma, if a zar eats truma, he's not only stealing the truma from the kohen, but he also is violating an iser of a macholas asuris, for which he's chayav misa b'dei shamayim, and there's special dinim in a shogeg situation that you have to add a chomesh. So not only do you have to compensate the kohen and pay him the keren, the market value of the truma, you have to add to boot another 20%. And Rava vacillates that these halachas of zar shachal truma apply in the case of trumas lachmei toda. Ola. Now, the source for the requirement of lechem echad, 1 of 10, is the pasuk mimenu mimenu, which appears exer shofar mimenu here, because it says v'hikriv mimenu, and it says the word mimenu in the parsha of Truma, specifically Trumas Maser, and therefore we seem to be upgrading the status of the Trumas Lachmei Toda to the status of real, full-fledged, bona fide Truma, which would mean, number one, that if he was a Zar and he ate it b'mezid, he's Chayav Misa b'dei Shamayim, and number two, if he ate it b'shogeg, he has to pay Keren v'chomesh. V'chein itztapek Rava, ha'im Truma zu midamas, kitrumas dagon olo. So now we're talking about truma that got mixed up with chulin. Normally, when heter, I should start with Isa. When Isa falls into a tarovis of heter, and it's what's called yavish b'yavish, everything is dry, then we apply the principle of rov, bittul b'rov. So if one piece of let's say chametz would fall, okay, chametz is a little bit different because it's a davar material. So let's give a simpler case. Let's say you have a beitzas nevela that falls into two beitzim of a shkuta, or for that matter, a basa shkuta that's dry and falls into a tarovis with two other pieces of basa shkuta. See how basa nevela is one, basa shkuta is two. Then we have a locha of azlin and basa ruba, otherwise known as bittul baro. Here, in the case of lachmei toda, and we're now focused on the lechem that's been separated, a loaf of bread, for the purpose of giving it to the Kohen. Now that loaf of bread gets mixed up with two other loaves of bread, which are chulin. And logically, we would have said yavish b'yavish, we apply the principle of bittul b'rov. But we don't apply the principle of bittul b'rov in truma. There's a separate halacha of truma, that truma is not batal b'rov. And Rava vacillates as to whether or not that halacha of truma, which is called medamas, applies to trumas lachmei toda as well. What is the status of trumas lachmei toda? Is it equal to trumas dagan, or is it not? And finally, just to finish this whole discussion about lachmei toda, the Torah says v'hikriv mimenu, and the Gemara darshans that you have to be notel lechem atruma min hamechubar. What does that mean? Min hamechubar, mi menu, from something that it's attached to. According to the opinion of Rashi, what that means is that at the moment of hafrasha, he has to have all 10 lechamim of that min sitting together in a kli, in one kli, and that's called tziruf kli in the laws of truma. You are mafresh truma from chulin when they are all together. The truma and the chulin are mixed together in one kli, and that requirement applies even to trumas lachmei toda according to Rashi. So we need that you have 10 lechamim, one of which is going to be designated for the Kohen, and all 10 are sitting in one kli. You have your tziruf kli, now you mafresh one of the 10 lechamim, you give it to the Kohen. That's the opinion of Rashi. Tosfos disagrees, and he says, Einam tzrichim el lios mukafim. Mukafim means no gimzebah. So you don't have to have the 10 lechamim inside a utensil, they just have to be touching one the other, which means that you have like a chadgadya in the sense that this lechem is mitzuref to this lechem, which in turn to this lechem, and like a dominoes, it goes straight across to all 10 lechem. But now let's go back to the pasuk. It says v'hikriv mimenu echad, and here we have a chiddush of Tosfos. Tosfos says that from the word echad, we're going to derive the conclusion that the lechem that you give as truma to the Kohen has to be shalem, as we mentioned earlier, and not parus. You don't slice the bread. You have to give him a shalem. That's called echad. Echad always indicates a shlemus, a completeness. But the pasuk also says, echad mikol karban. What do we derive from mikol karban? And Tosfos claims based on a brisa in Menachos, Shiu kol hakarbonos halechem shavim b'truma zu, v'lo yitol truma mimin echad al chavero. Now, the second half of this price, I understand. The first half goes beyond. The second half says that you can't take one lechem from this min and be mafresh it for another min. Each min needs one lechem that's designated from that min for the kohen. And that's called mikol korban. But the first part of this brisa, I don't understand. You kol karbanos halechem shavim b'truma zu. And once again, I plead the fifth without a Gemara Menachos. I don't know what's going on. I'll tell you what I think he means, but again, this is a pure speculation on my part. What he's saying is that not only are you required to be mafresh for the Kohen one lechem from each min, but all the four lechamim should be equal, should be shavim. I mean, it reminds me of what we discussed earlier today, that each category of lechem, of the four categories, requires a certain volume of shemen. So, for example, we mentioned that the revucha needs a revius of a lug, meaning half of the chatzi lug of shemen. And now, what we're saying is that even though each min has its own requirements and its own, its own manner and surah and amount of shemen, but nevertheless, when it comes to the lechem, you've got 10 lechamim from each min, and one lechem from each of those four minim of 10 each has got to be donated to the Kohen. Each lechem should be shaveh. It should be equal. You shouldn't be a lopsided thing where from one lechem, that's a very large lechem, he takes it from the revucha, and he takes another lechem from the chalos, which is much smaller, and he gets a gigantic one from the rekikim, and so forth and so on. It should all be a standard size. Okay, let's make a note of where we got up to. Steve, I'm going to ask you to be my monitor. Just a simple thing to remind me, but I just don't remember. To make sure I have the Gemara Menachos, on the table. It's just a few feet from here. Okay.